All right, when discussing why a heart block is such a bad thing and its effects, I think it's important to actually know the pathway of electrodes in the heart and the cardiac cycle and how this affects the ECG as well. So, firstly, we start with electrical charges in the SA node. These positive electric charges travel down in all directions, but if you take the mean direction of the way they travel down, you get a big arrow towards the AV node. And when you have positive charges traveling in a positive direction, you get a raise in the ECG graph. And so you can see this in the P wave, the raised atrial depolarization stage. And then so they're in the AV node. The AV node hoards them for a little bit of time, and that time is displayed in the ECG graph as well as a straight line because it's hoarding these little charges for a little bit before it releases them down the ventricles. And so when it's hoarding them, nothing's happening, straight line. And then you get down, so as the positive charges are traveling down the ventricles, the left ventricle is much thicker than the right ventricle. And so the direction of the left ventricle, you have things going in all directions, charges going in all directions, but the overwhelming side of this, the mean of all these charges is a big arrow in this direction. And when you have positive towards negative, you get a drop in the graph, and this is where we see in the Q wave. But anyway, they're going that way. But the positive charges are still traveling down the ventricles. And as they're traveling down the ventricles, energy has been released in all different types of directions. But of course, since the left is bigger and thicker, the mean arrow is a big fat arrow going straight towards the positive side of the part. And as we know, when positive electrodes are traveling towards the positive direction, you get a raise seen in the R part. And then as the charges are traveling down, they continue traveling down the ventricles. See here, and once they get to the end, the arrows are currently going in this direction of the mean electrical charge towards the negative end of the heart. And this results in the dip, as can see in the S phase of the ECG graph. Now that you have all these charges around the heart is completely depolarized, so you don't see anything rise in the heart. The heart's completely depolarized. And then you get the repolarization of the heart when all these positives start turning to negative ions, and because all these positives have started turning towards negative ions, a negative arrow begins going in the general direction, because all these positive electrodes are turning negative, making a giant arrow going up towards the negative side, which results in the T raised in the graph, because when you have negative to negative, it's positive in the ECG graph. And this is represented as the T wave, or the ventricular repolarization.
All right, now that I've discussed the general path of electrodes throughout the heart, I can talk about my condition, which is a heart block or a bundle branch block, which is when one of the ventricles, the left or right ventricle, is blocked off, and the electrodes, which are traveling down to stimulate ventricular contraction, can no longer travel down this pathway, or they might have to find a slower alternative route. And the main concern with this is this disruption could affect the mechanical output of the heart, which could reduce the stroke volume, which is the amount of blood pumped with each beat. And this can also reduce the heart's ejection fraction, which is the percentage of blood pumped out of the ventricle relative to the amount that is filled. In healthy individuals, this fraction ranges from 50 to 70%. So firstly, heart blocks are categorized into 3 main degrees, each with its own ECG pattern. So the first degree is a first degree AV block. In this condition, electrical impulses still reach the vesicles, but conduction through the AV node is just slower than normal. On an ECG, this appears a prolonged PR interval, which is greater than, it's identified as a PR interval greater than 200 milliseconds. The rhythm remains regular, but the delay just indicates a slower electrical conduction. The second type is a second degree AV block, which are when some electrical impulses fail to reach the ventricles. There's 2 different forms of this. The first is Mobitz type 1. In this pattern, the PR interval gradually becomes longer with each beat until eventually a P wave occurs without a corresponding QRS complex, meaning the ventricle does not contract for that beat. This happens because the AV node cells gradually fatigue, causing progressive delay, so the signal is temporarily blocked for that beat. The second form is a Mobitz type 2, which is more sensitive, or which is more serious. In this case, the PR interval stays constant, but occasionally a P wave is not followed by a QRS complex. That means the electrical signal just suddenly fails to conduct to the ventricles just randomly with no warning. And the most severe form is a third degree AV block, also known as complete heart block. In this condition, no electrical signals from the atria reach the ventricles. These two beat independently of each other. And on the ACG, this will look like P waves that have no relationship with the QRS complex. Because the ventricles rely on a slower escape rhythm, the heart rate becomes much lower and less effective at pumping blood, which has a number of complications. So for health concern and common treatment, the severity of a heart block really just determines on the level and degree. So first degree heart blocks are usually pretty mild and don't really require treatment. A lot of people actually have this and don't even realize. A second degree heart block may or may not require treatment, just depending on the type. Mobitz type 1 is usually less serious and usually just requires monitoring, but doctors could recommend a pacemaker. Type 2 is more dangerous because it's just unpredictable. Like, at least the first one's predictable, but patients with this condition, type 2, are usually required to have a pacemaker. And third degree is, of course, it's the most serious. It can lead to dizziness, fainting, shortness of breath, chest pain, even sudden cardiac arrest. And for all these reasons, patients are always required to wear a permanent pacemaker to restore electrical activity and maintain proper blood circulation.